The first man died at dawn, and before the sun had set, every one of the 100 chosen was gone. These were not ordinary men, nor victims of plague or simple poison. They were the 100 strongest and most beautiful young men in Babylon, each personally selected for what was said to be the highest honor of their lives, a single night with Queen Semiramis. They had entered her chamber full of life, strength, and pride at being chosen. But by morning they emerged as walking corpses, their bodies drained, their eyes vacant, their voices silenced, collapsing one after another until none were left alive. Physicians of the kingdom tried desperately to explain the sudden affliction, but no cure could be found, no disease identified, and no remedy worked.
Ow.
The palace fell into chaos. Servants whispered of curses, priests muttered about forbidden rituals, and hardened soldiers trembled at what they saw. And yet through all of it, the queen remained untouched, radiant and terrifyingly calm. The sole survivor of a night that had swallowed 100 souls. This was no ordinary tragedy, but the beginning of one of history's darkest and most unsettling legends. What happened in that chamber? Was it poison unknown to men, the work of gods long forgotten, or something far worse, the deliberate act of a woman who had ceased to be human? For centuries the whispers would not fade, because this was not a moment of madness or accident. This was the night that Queen Semiramis set into motion the most methodical mass sacrifice the ancient world would ever know. A night planned not in passion, but in precision, designed to transform her into something beyond mortal comprehension, something infinitely more dangerous. 6 months before that fatal night, the preparations had already begun. Records carved into palace tablets revealed the chilling precision with which 100 young men were chosen. And merciless, they had to be between 16 and 22 years old. Physically flawless, virgins untouched by women, and possessing what the texts describe as spiritual purity. Royal assessors traveled across the empire, visiting slave markets and examining thousands of candidates. They measured height, checked teeth, studied skin, and even the patterns of birthmarks. But the selection was not only about perfection, it was about silence. Each chosen youth had to be an orphan, a boy with no parents, no siblings, no ties, and no one who would ever come looking for him. Once chosen, they were taken to a secluded wing of the palace where their lives changed overnight. For 3 months, they lived like princes, served the finest grains and herbs prepared in strict portions, fed no meat, and given drinks laced with subtle compounds that modern researchers believe were mild psychoactive drugs. Every day they bathed in rare oils imported from Egypt, their bodies perfumed with incense carried from Arabia. They were educated in reading and writing, trained in music, and told again and again that they were chosen for divine service, blessed beyond measure, destined for an honor that would lift them above the rest of mankind. Archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets written by some of these young men, their words filled with gratitude and excitement. They wrote letters of joy, praising their fortune at being personally selected by the queen, completely unaware that what they were recording were not the beginnings of a glorious life, but the obituaries of their own deaths. For 3 months they lived in luxury, believing they had been lifted from misery to paradise, but in truth they were being carefully prepared, fattened, and shaped like sacrificial offerings. As one historian later observed, they were not guests of the palace, they were ingredients. And every bath, every meal, every lesson was a step toward their final purpose. And though they thought they were chosen to be loved by their queen, the truth was far more terrifying. They were chosen to be consumed by her, as the fateful night drew closer. The queen's own bedchamber was transformed into something unrecognizable, a place no longer meant for sleep, but for sacrifice. Where once there had been silk sheets and golden furniture, now obsidian tiles lined the floor, each carved with symbols that hurt the eyes of anyone who dared to look directly at them. The walls were painted with markings in a script older than any known language, strokes that seemed to shift and crawl when touched by torchlight. At the center, the queen's bed was replaced by an altar carved from a single massive block of black granite, dragged from distant mountains and polished until it gleamed like liquid darkness. Every detail of the chamber had been designed for the ritual, and no one who worked on it lived to speak of what they had seen. The laborers who carried the stones, who painted the walls, who set the tiles into place all, were executed once their task was complete, their bodies sealed within the very walls they had built. The queen would allow no living witness to survive, no one to reveal what had been prepared inside those doors. When the night of the spring equinox finally arrived, the chamber was ready, the moonless sky above, perfectly aligned with the queen's chosen hour. At sunset, the first youth was brought inside, and according to the sole survivor Theron, whose testimony would one day be discovered hidden in the temple of Nabuich, death took no longer than 6 minutes. The ritual was not frenzied or wild, but methodical, as if rehearsed countless times in secret. The queen's voice carried words older than civilization itself, syllables that twisted the air and bent reality. And each victim submitted willingly, their minds lost in a trance of religious ecstasy. Convinced that they were ascending to divine glory, Theron alone survived, and only by accident.
8.
The paralytic poison used to keep the victim still a venom derived from a now extinct Mesopotamian plant should have taken hold of him as it did the others, but by chance of rare blood. His body carried a genetic resistance, a hidden immunity that shielded him. The poison had been meant only to silence movement, not to kill. For what ended the lives of the chosen was something far darker, something no simple medicine could explain. Forced to lie motionless among the growing heap of lifeless bodies, Theron watched with unblinking terror as the queen spoke, chanted, and transformed before his eyes. He had thought himself the luckiest man in Babylon, blessed to be chosen by his queen, but as he watched the ritual unfold, he realized the truth. He had not been chosen for love or honor, but for death, and every moment that passed brought him closer to becoming nothing more than another offering to her unholy transformation. The ritual began as the sun disappeared, and the chamber became a world cut off from reason. Theron would later describe it in words that still make the blood run cold. Each victim lasted only 6 minutes, their deaths carried out with a precision that suggested the queen had rehearsed every movement countless times before. In a language older than mankind, syllables that vibrated with a resonance that made stone tremble and shadows quiver. The young men went willingly, their minds broken by months of preparation. Convinced they were not being slaughtered, but being elevated to the realm of gods, smiling, chanting, weeping with joy, they surrendered their lives in ecstatic obedience, while their blood flowed across the black tiles in impossible patterns. Streams bending against gravity to feed the altar at the chamber's center, as Theron lay frozen among the dead, feigning lifelessness, he witnessed horrors that no sane mind could endure. By the 20th victim, the queen herself no longer looked entirely human. Her movements lost their natural rhythm, becoming too smooth, like water pretending to be flesh. Her eyes reflected the torchlight like those of a predator, and her voice carried tones no human throat could produce. By the 50th, the chamber itself rebelled against the natural world. The temperature dropped so sharply that frost spread across the volcanic tiles. Shadows detached themselves from their sources and took on shapes with vast wings, and the very air vibrated with whispers and countless voices. Though only the queen remained inside, those outside the chamber reported hearing things as well. Hardened soldiers guarding the door swore they heard choirs of voices chanting in unison, tones that echoed like thunder, yet contained melodies too precise for human tongues. Some fled in terror, others vomited where they stood, but none dared open the doors until dawn. Inside, Theron's nightmare only deepened. The blood of the victims formed spirals, feeding the altar in geometrical patterns too perfect to be chance. And every new body seemed to feed the queen's strength. She never faltered, never tired, her radiance growing as life drained from the men around her. By the time the 100th sacrifice had been made, the chamber was no longer a place for mortals. At its center, seated among 99 lifeless forms, arranged in a spiral that mirrored the flow of blood itself, Queen Semiramis sat transformed, her face shining with an unnatural light, her body vibrating with power that had no place in this world. To look at her directly was to feel the world spin and nausea take hold, and yet she sat as if nothing unnatural had occurred, her breath steady, her body untouched by fatigue, her eyes brighter than fire. When the guards finally entered at dawn, hardened men who had faced war and bloodshed, they fled the chamber in panic, vomiting from the sight. For at its center was their queen alive, radiant, and utterly changed, surrounded by a spiral of corpses that seemed less like the result of murder and more like the completion of a terrible design. What had taken place was not an act of madness or a frenzy of cruelty. It was deliberate, calculated, and perfectly executed. The night when a woman willingly cast aside her humanity and stepped into the realm of the monstrous divine. From that night forward, the queen was no longer the same being who had entered the chamber. Something had changed at the core of her existence, and those who served her saw it immediately. She stopped eating normal food, her meals left untouched, while secret ceremonies were arranged each month behind closed doors. Only a few priests were allowed to witness these feedings, and those who broke their vows of silence were later found dead, their bodies shriveled and drained as if every drop of life had been stolen from them. Even hardened physicians who examined the corpses could not explain the rapid cellular collapse, the evidence of accelerated aging that left young men and women looking like dried husks centuries old. Her physical presence became unbearable. Her eyes no longer reflected light like human eyes, but burned so fiercely that those who looked into them felt stabbing pain, as if gazing into the sun. Her movements grew unnaturally fluid, her head able to turn in ways no human body should allow, her steps so smooth that it seemed her feet barely touched the ground. Court scribes recorded that she no longer aged, her face more radiant and youthful after the ritual than before. Her skin emitted a faint glow in dark rooms, a sickly luminescence that unsettled everyone who saw it. Most terrifying was her new voice, a weapon that no sword could match. With a single word she could compel absolute obedience. A guard who resisted in order to open the treasury suddenly found his hands betraying him, unlocking the doors against his own will. A priest who tried to hide sacred texts discovered his body, delivering them to her without his mind's consent. Even scribes who attempted to write accounts of her deeds found their own stylus moving to praise her, their hands guided by something outside their control. She did not command loyalty. She stole it, overriding free will itself with a sound that carried harmonics beyond human range. The shadows of the palace no longer behaved as shadows should. They moved independently, forming hands that could choke a servant who dared whisper against her, standing guard at her doors even when no soldiers were present. Some servants claimed the shadows watched them, following them through the halls, patient and alive. The palace astronomer, who studied these anomalies too closely, went mad, swearing that the shadows had depth and that staring into them was like gazing into an abyss that stared back. The palace itself began to move like an extension of her will. Servants no longer acted as individuals, but as parts of a hive, turning corners in perfect synchrony, blinking at the same instant, their personalities dissolving until they became little more than extensions of her presence. Foreign ambassadors wrote in horror of their visits, describing the court as a living machine, one mind spread across 100 bodies, all bound to the queen's invisible command. Her speech also changed, carrying words in a language no one could transcribe. Court scribes bled from the nose when they tried, their hands cramping until they dropped their stylus in pain. The sounds she produced contained frequencies beyond human hearing, forcing those nearby to feel vibrations in their bones rather than their ears. Priests swore she was speaking to the gods, while others whispered that her conversations reached beings older than creation itself, through blood, ritual, and sacrifice. Semiramis had achieved what many rulers across the world had only dreamed of. She had become more than human, a creature that hovered between mortal and divine. Yet this transformation, while granting her unimaginable power, was not stable. It clashed against the limits of human flesh, twisting her into something both magnificent and monstrous. And though her people trembled before her, the cost of her new existence was only beginning to be revealed. The queen's transformation did not remain confined to her body. It spread outward, poisoning the very heart of Babylon. Within days, the city began to unravel under a curse that defied reason. Animals were the first to sense it. Horses, oxen, goats, even the sacred temple beasts broke free of their pens and cages, fleeing in wild herds that stormed through the streets as if driven by an invisible terror. Birds took to the skies in black clouds, insects vanished, and rats poured from the city in disciplined columns, abandoning their hiding places. In a mass exodus, those creatures too old, too young, or too weak to escape simply lay down and died. Not of disease or hunger, but of something far more chilling, what ancient texts describe as spiritual exhaustion. The will to live itself extinguished, the land followed. Gardens closest to the palace withered first, the lush greenery turning to gray ash while still rooted in the soil. Then, in perfect concentric circles, the blight spread outward 13 cubits every day, advancing with mathematical precision. Palm trees that had survived centuries of drought crumbled to powder overnight. The famous hanging gardens, one of the wonders of the world, collapsed into lifeless terraces of dust before the month had ended. Scholars recorded the destruction meticulously, horrified to see species that had grown since Babylon's founding vanish forever. Then came the river. For 3 days, the Euphrates, lifeblood of the city, ran backward, its waters darkening too. A thick, oil-like substance that burned to the touch with a freezing cold. Fishermen spoke of frostbite in the desert sun. Boats capsizing as the current defied nature, and fish rotting within minutes of their death. Their flesh riddled with impossible deformities, too many eyes, too many mouths, shapes that had no place in the natural order. When the river returned to its normal flow, it carried with it stones that whispered, weeds with human-like eyes, carcasses of creatures no man had ever seen. The apparitions followed. At first, only those who had helped prepare the ritual chamber saw them: guards, servants, attendants, who swore they glimpsed pale figures standing in corners. Young men with slit throats staring silently, their presence heavy and accusing. But soon the vision spread beyond the palace. Across the city, people began seeing them, always the same 100 youths, always marked with the wounds of their sacrifice, always silent, always watching. Children drew their faces in clay before their parents had ever laid eyes on them. The pattern of appearances matched the spiral of bodies in the ritual chamber, expanding outward until the entire city lay within the ghostly design, as if the queen's killing pattern had burned itself into the very fabric of Babylon. With the apparitions came nightmares. At the same hour every night, 3:33 in the morning, thousands awoke screaming. Having dreamed the same vision, trapped in a dark chamber, surrounded by boys with bleeding throats, unable to move or speak as something vast and inhuman approached from the shadows. Children woke in terror, adults refused to sleep, and soon the city was driven into mass insomnia. Some died from exhaustion, others from madness, but none escaped the curse. The physical world twisted in tandem with the visions. Cold spots appeared, where the victims had fallen, so frigid that water froze instantly, despite the desert heat. Fires erupted spontaneously in storerooms where the ritual oils had once been kept, burning without fuel until everything was consumed. Objects shifted, on their own, moving in spirals that mimicked the queen's steps during the ritual. Every corner of Babylon became an echo of that terrible night. Ancient belief held that when rituals were corrupted, they tore open the barrier between the mortal world and the spiritual realm. Babylon had not just been cursed, it had been wounded, ripped open to forces that should never have entered. The Greeks would later call it miasma, the Celts a thin place, the Chinese shaki. But Babylon had become something worse, a permanent wound in reality itself. Bleeding into every life that dwelled within its walls, merchants stopped entering the city. Ambassadors described it as a place where ghosts followed their every step, where shadows clung too closely, where the air itself felt poisoned. Trade collapsed, hunger spread, and foreign nations circled like vultures, sensing weakness. The people of Babylon lowered their eyes, walked with their heads bowed, and whispered of the curse that had devoured their city. And at the center of it all sat their queen, radiant, monstrous, and untouchable, the very source of the nightmare that had turned the world's greatest city into a living grave. For all the horror she unleashed, Queen Semiramis did not act without purpose. Beneath the ritual, beneath the blood and the curse, there was one driving force: her son, Adad-nirari III. When her husband, King Shamshi-Adad, died suddenly, the boy was only 10 years old, a child seated on a throne surrounded by predators. In the ancient world, a child king was little more than an open invitation for chaos, and vultures began circling at once. Generals whispered of their own divine right to rule. The kingdom's enemies massed armies on the borders, and assassination plots bloomed within the palace walls. Even the council of nobles discussed openly whether the boy should be replaced by a stronger candidate, while priests doubted whether a child could fulfill the sacred duties of kingship. In that time, an illegitimate ruler was seen as an insult to the gods. In every misfortune, famine, plague, defeat would be blamed on the weakness of the throne. Semiramis faced choices that all ended in ruin. She could flee with her son to Egypt, but he would be branded forever as the coward king who ran. She could try to lead armies herself, but as a woman, she would only provoke rebellion. She could negotiate with rivals, but every compromise would erode her son's authority. So instead, she turned to the forbidden knowledge hidden in the most secret chambers of the royal library. Ancient tablets that spoke of kings and queens who had transformed themselves into more than human. Rituals of blood and sacrifice that promised not survival, but supremacy. Her research was deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly rational. She consulted sorcerers from India, priests from Egypt, and shamans from the steppes, piecing together fragments of knowledge that others had long since condemned as blasphemy. She experimented in secret, conducting smaller sacrifices to test the process, measuring blood, refining incantations, and calculating the exact conditions required. When she committed to the full ritual, she knew precisely what it would demand: 100 lives, no more, no less. Yet even as she prepared for mass murder, she remained a mother. She spent her days with her son, teaching him statecraft, playing games, telling him stories of great kings, commissioning portraits of them together, and writing letters for him to read on future birthdays. One surviving tablet, found centuries later, bears her words: "Everything I do so that you might live and rule in peace." She chose his tutors, arranged his advisors, and even selected potential brides for alliances, all while planning the slaughter of 100 innocents. To the world, she became a monster, but to her son she remained a mother, weaving her love into every step of her descent. When the ritual was complete, her son was protected by a force so absolute that no rival dared challenge him. The 3 generals who had claimed the throne fell silent. One fled to distant lands, one took holy vows, and one was found mysteriously dead. The Elamite armies massing on the border retreated overnight, their king claiming he had been visited by divine warnings. In his dreams, the nobles who plotted against Adad-nirari began confessing to crimes they had not been accused of, begging forgiveness, while others vanished entirely. From that day forward, it became clear to all that threatening the child king was to invite a fate worse than death. But for young Adad-nirari, the price of protection was terror. Later writings from his reign speak of the dark years when my mother wore another face. He wrote of fearing her eyes, of hearing voices when she spoke, of feeling a chill in her presence, even in the heat of summer. Yet he also admitted that her power kept him safe, that no one dared raise a hand against him, and that he survived to adulthood only because she had given up her humanity. One of his tablets reads, "My mother gave up her soul so that I might keep mine. I rule because she was willing to become what no man could face." In her mind, every horror was justified by love. In her logic, if power protected children, then absolute power was the only guarantee of their survival. If fear kept enemies at bay, then supernatural fear made them flee without a fight. If sacrifice brought divine favor, then the ultimate sacrifice would bring ultimate favor. She became a monster not out of hatred or greed, but out of devotion. And in doing so, she twisted the purest human instinct, maternal love, to the darkest force of all, as Babylon withered under curses and nightmares. The priests of the land realized that their queen was no longer a ruler, but an abomination that threatened the very balance of the world. Citizens fled, trade collapsed, and even the temples of other gods reported disturbances. Shadows moving across sacred fires, voices echoing where silence should have been. The high priest of Marduk finally declared that what Semiramis had become was not divine, but a violation of divinity itself, a corruption that could not be tolerated. Yet to confront her was madness, for she could bend bodies with her voice, command shadows as soldiers, and was guarded by 100 restless ghosts. Still, the priests knew that if nothing was done, the city itself would perish. So they conceived the unthinkable, putting their queen on trial. Preparations took months of secrecy. Priests from every major temple in Mesopotamia were summoned, from Marduk, Ishtar, and Shamash, to lesser gods rarely named outside their own cities. Foreign holy men were smuggled into Babylon, Egyptian priests of Thoth, Hittite shamans of the storm god, and even mystics from the Indus Valley. They could not meet openly, for fear of her supernatural awareness, so they communicated in coded messages and met in shared dreams through ancient meditation practices. Piece by piece, they built an underground alliance, a shadow government, a faith that plotted the prosecution of a creature who was half goddess, half monster. The evidence they gathered was both physical and spiritual. Theron, the sole survivor of the ritual, was hidden deep within temple crypts and questioned relentlessly. His testimony carved onto 17 tablets that described every moment of that terrible night. Samples of crystallized blood taken from the chamber, fragments of burned plants that had turned to ash, jars of river water collected during the Euphrates reversal. All were stored as proof. Priests trained in divination added their own findings, cracked oracle bones that spelled accusations, sacred flames that burned in unnatural colors, omens recorded across the sky. Even reality itself seemed to testify against her. The problem was not only how to prosecute her, but how to bring her into court. The answer lay in her only weakness, her son. Using marriage negotiations as the excuse, the priests persuaded young Adad-Nirari to invite his mother to bless a ceremony at the Great Ziggurat. Around the sacred structure they wove protections more elaborate than any Babylon had ever seen. Salt carried from primordial seas, meteoric iron carved with binding, runes, blood spilled willingly by chosen sacrifices, all layered into barriers designed to hold even a being who had surpassed mortality. The trap was baited with her maternal love, one bond that even power could not sever. When she entered the court, reality bent around her. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in moments. Shadows writhed on the walls like living serpents. And when she spoke her first words of defense, 7 priests collapsed, bleeding from ears and nose. Pottery across the temple shattered, and pregnant women within miles miscarried from the force of her voice. But the assembled priests answered with their own harmonics, chanting in unison, weaving countersounds into sacred geometries etched on the floor, turning her power back against itself. What followed was less a trial and more a metaphysical battle disguised as law, courtroom where gods themselves were summoned as witnesses. The statue of Marduk wept blood, the sacred flames of Shamash burned black, and in the most terrifying moment of all, the ghost of Shamshi-Adad, her own husband, appeared to testify, declaring his wife a corrupter who had abandoned humanity and upset the balance of creation. Then, in silent ranks, the 100 sacrificed boys manifested, their spectral forms filling the temple, their throats cut, their eyes fixed on her. For the first time since her transformation, Semiramis trembled. The judges debated not only law but theology. Could one who had transcended mortality be bound by mortal rules? Did transformation into godhood excuse every crime? If so, others might follow her path, sacrificing hundreds in pursuit of the same power. If not, then for the first time in history, gods themselves could be judged by men. The priests knew the weight of their decisions stretched far beyond Babylon. For 3 days they deliberated, while Semiramis remained bound within the sacred wards, struggling against chains of divine light woven from sacrifice and prayer. At last they delivered the sentence. Death alone was insufficient for one who had consumed 100 souls. Instead, they decreed complete spiritual annihilation. Only the destruction of her body, but the erasure of her soul, her memory, and even the possibility of resurrection. To achieve this, 7 sacred flames would be combined: the purifying fire of Shamash, consuming blaze of Jibal, the celestial fire of Inu, and others, each chosen to burn away a different aspect of her corrupted existence. Her execution would be public, not merely to punish her, but to prove to the world that even a god queen could face justice when she violated the cosmic order. It was a decision that would echo across centuries, for in attempting to destroy a monster, the priests of Babylon had invented something new: the concept that no ruler, no matter how powerful, stood above the law of gods or men. But though they had passed sentence, the true test had yet to come, for no one knew whether even sacred fire could truly end what Semiramis had become. When the priests led Semiramis to her execution, thousands gathered in the great courtyard of Babylon to witness the impossible. The pyre itself was a marvel of sacred engineering, built from 7 types of holy wood taken from temple groves, tended for generations, cedar from Lebanon for purification, sandalwood from India for spirit binding, olive wood soaked in consecrated oils for divine judgment. Each log was laid according to celestial patterns, mirroring the constellations on the night of her ritual, and every piece of timber had been blessed with water from sacred rivers, blood from willing sacrifices, and prayers whispered by virgin priestesses who had spent months preparing the fire, bound in chains of divine light. Semiramis resisted, her voice nearly breaking through the wards. 3 priests died instantly, their hearts bursting, while others aged decades in minutes, their hair turning white as they fought to hold the barriers firm. In the final moment, the priests forced her son, Adad Nerari, to speak the binding words. The boy wept as he pronounced the ritual that condemned his own mother, and she, looking at him with something like pride, smiled as the chains tightened. Witnesses swore her expression was not rage or despair, but a mother's approval, as though in that instant she cared more for her son's survival than her own damnation. The flames were lit, and the fire consumed her for 3 days and nights. The heat was so great it warped bronze and cracked stone pillars 50 feet away. Yet the priests, standing within arm's reach, remained untouched, their bodies shielded by divine wards. The air filled with sounds that no human throat could produce, harmonics that shattered pottery across the city, killed birds in flight, and caused miscarriages in pregnant women miles away. But worse than the physical devastation were the psychic screams. Her voice reached directly into the minds of those who listened, pouring meaning without words, prophecies of destruction. Curses on bloodlines, cosmic truths too terrible to understand. Temple scribes tried to write them down, only to find themselves scribbling in languages they did not know, producing texts so dangerous that they were immediately burned. When the fire finally died, the priests approached to collect the ashes. But what they found made even hardened executioners recoil. Her body had not been reduced to dust. Instead, her bones had transformed into crystalline matter, black as obsidian, yet clear as diamond, warm to the touch as if still alive. They whispered directly into the minds of those who held them, bleeding when cut, each drop crystallizing into razor-sharp fragments. And worse still, they grew larger day by day, slowly, imperceptibly, but undeniably alive. Attempts to destroy, the remains failed, and thrown into the Euphrates, the bones returned to the shore against the current. When buried, the ground bled and trembled with earthquakes. When scattered, the fragments crawled back together across miles of desert. One priest who tried grinding them into powder found that each grain became a perfect replica of the whole, multiplying instead of vanishing. What the priests had created was not an end, but a new horror. They had killed her body, but her essence had transcended death, leaving behind relics that were not bones but seeds. In desperation, foreign priests, who had joined the trial, proposed containment. 7 caskets were forged from meteoric iron, scribed inside and out with symbols from every major faith: Babylonian, Egyptian, Hittite, Indian, layered protections designed to resist not only physical force but spiritual corruption. Bones were divided and sealed separately. each piece buried in a different temple far across the known world, hidden and guarded in secrecy. The priests admitted these containers were not a final solution but a delay, a way to hold the horror, until someone, someday, discovered a way to truly destroy it. That was nearly 3,000 years ago, and no such method has ever been found. The crystallized bones of Semiramis still exist, somewhere in the ruins of forgotten temples or in the basements of modern museums, still warm to the touch, still whispering in languages older than mankind, still waiting for someone foolish enough to open the seals. For centuries, people wondered whether the nightmare of Semiramis was a myth or a terrible truth. But history leaves traces that cannot be erased. Her real name, Semiramis, appears in Assyrian records around 810 BCE. Ruling as a regent for her young son, Adad-nirari III, she led armies into battle, negotiated treaties in her own name, and performed rituals reserved only for kings. Inscriptions call her Queen of the Universe, Mother of Kings, she who speaks for the gods, titles so shocking that later rulers chiseled them away, replacing her achievements with generic prayers, as if to erase parts of her story too dangerous to be remembered. Greek and Roman historians who wrote centuries later preserved fragments of her legend, details that matched her true reign too closely to be coincidence. Ctesias described her as both ruler and monster. Herodotus whispered of her in horror. Diodorus wrote of her unnatural powers. They spoke of the same numbers, the spiral of sacrifices, the crystallized remains, as if all drawing from sources now lost to time. Archaeological discoveries added to the unease. In 1962, excavation uncovered a mass grave of 90 to 100 young men, aged 16 to 25. All dead at once, arranged in a spiral around a central point where the soil bore signs of chemical anomalies. The site was quickly sealed, the report buried, and the team reassigned, as though someone wanted the truth hidden. Looted tablets that appeared briefly on the black market in the late 20th century described the ritual of 100 gates, and she who ate the sun and spoke with shadow voices before vanishing into private collections. And in Nimrod, ground-penetrating radar revealed a sealed chamber beneath the palace, matching the descriptions of her ritual chamber, but war prevented excavation before the site was destroyed. To some, the legend was born of misogyny, men unable to accept a woman wielding such power, inventing horrors to explain it. But the Semiramis legend does not follow that pattern. Unlike cautionary tales, she was not punished for her power. She transcended through it. She was not diminished, was amplified beyond humanity itself. The legend does not weaken her memory, it magnifies it, describing not a victim but a being who deliberately chose monstrosity. That makes her story different from myth. It reads, not like allegory, but like testimony, a crime scene written in the language of fear. The most chilling truth is that her transformation worked. Her son survived, reigned, and died an old man, his rule secured by the shadow of a mother who had abandoned her humanity. 100 lives for one throne, a city cursed, so that one boy might grow into a king. Mathematics of monstrosity born of maternal love. In her mind, it was not madness but sacrifice, not cruelty but devotion. Proof that even the purest instinct can become the darkest force when combined with power and desperation. And still the story does not end. For the 7 containers forged from meteoric iron were never meant to be final. They were built to contain, not to destroy, and their guardians are long gone. Somewhere in the ruins of forgotten temples, or in the private vaults of collectors, lie the crystallized remains of Semiramis, still warm after nearly 3,000 years, still whispering in tongues that predate mankind, still growing imperceptibly, waiting for someone to open the seals and release what should never have existed. The legend teaches one final lesson, that myths are not fantasies, but memories. Truths too terrible for history to preserve. Every dragon was once a beast, every god once a ruler, every nightmare once a lived reality. Semiramis stands as the ultimate warning of what happens when love becomes obsession, when power corrupts not only a throne, but the soul itself. She shows us that civilization is never far from collapse. that under the right pressure, even the most sacred bond a mother's love can be twisted into damnation. So when you hear her name whispered as legend, remember the bones sealed in. Iron, still alive, still whispering in the dark, waiting for the day someone listens. And when you think of myths as fantasy, remember that every story began as someone's truth.